Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this session. I think this has been the centenary year of Jallianwala Bagh, and enough has been written about it for most audiences to know what actually happened and the heart of the matter. So I won't go too much detail into the facts, but for those who may not know, in very brief terms, 100 years ago, on the harvest festival day of Baisakhi, April 13th, a crowd of varying figures, but probably around 15 to 20,000, gathered in an enclosed space of about 6 to 7 acres area with very narrow exits and some of them closed. A British force under Brigadier General Dyer rolled in with 50 soldiers, 50 rifles and 40 others, and without warning shot into this protest meeting. At the most conservative estimate, about 500 to 600 people were killed, and about double or triple that number were left wounded without medical assistance. Now, this massacre became a sort of iconic massacre, if there's a thing like that in modern Indian history, which probably goes up somewhere along with the ranks of the Soweto riots or the suppression of the Mau Mau or the Wounded Knee massacre, in terms of what a deep impact it has left on the Indian psyche. And it is believed, and that is something which we are going to debate, that it turned around the direction of India's freedom movement. It caused considerable debate in the United Kingdom itself. And ultimately, 21 years after the massacre, the Lieutenant Governor of the province, who was also called O'Dwyer, not Dyer, was assassinated by a man called Udham Singh. Now, here with me I have two wonderful writers. On my right, Anita, Anand, who has written now a fabulous book on Udham Singh, who was the patient assassin and the title of this session, and Dr. Kim Wagner, who's done an extremely detailed and admirable micro-history of those critical days of 1919. So I'm going to start by asking them, and Kim, may I start with you? So much has been written about Jallianwala Bagh. Why did you have to write this book? Is it simply to catch the centenary flavor? Or?
I saw all my my colleagues, banking in on the First World War centenary. I've worked previously on 1857, and always had it sort of in the back of my mind, always lurking in the back. The Amritsar Massacre has sort of been a point of reference in terms of colonial violence, and it's usually seen exclusively as a 20th century event, something that follows on from the First World War, and that points towards independence in 47. But coming at it from the 19th century, I thought there was a lot of continuities and a lot of things, especially when I was working on the violent suppression of the uprising of 1857, when Indian rebels were blown from cannon and you had mass killings. A lot of the things that were being said at that time resonated with what Dyer later said in 1919. And so I thought this is almost like a natural progression in that sense.
Actually, in your introduction, you say this event is quote-unquote poorly understood in India, and you're going to explain it to us. You have to explain that, because there are dozens of scholars who've studied this in India, and Indians feel we understand it very well.
I think the problem for me is that Amritsar is exclusively seen as a catalyst for independence, and exclusively as something that's of importance because of 1947. And I think that sort of overdetermines how the events of 1919 are understood, because nobody in 1919 knew that independence was coming. And so you have this sort of thick layer of nationalist narrative that in many ways overdetermines how the massacre is described. The victims are described as martyrs, just talk about heroism, and of course the British become villains. I think in a lot of the literature, a lot of the fictional depictions, I'm of course referring to Attenborough's Gandhi movie here, it's really a sort of two-dimensional cartoon character in terms of the British, and it seems almost natural or self-evident to describe Dyer as evil, and I thought we need more complexity if we want to understand that.
I'm going to come back to that point of giving complexity to Dyer and the dangers therein. But heroism you mentioned, and one of the heroes of Jallianwala Bagh is Udham Singh. So your motivation for writing this book?
So first of all, those of you who don't know about Udham Singh, you painted the picture of what happened that day in the garden. But the legend that Punjabis certainly know is that there was a young teenager in the garden who was an orphan, and he was serving water in the garden when the guns start firing. And like so many hundreds of other people, he's trapped in the garden by Dyer's curfew, and he is there in the garden and he hears the screaming turning to whimpering, turning to silence, and it drives him mad. And in the first light of morning, he grabs a clod of earth soaked in blood, and he says, no matter how long it takes, no matter where it takes me, I'm going to find the men who did this and kill them with as little mercy as they have shown my countrymen. That is a story that if you are Punjabi, you know, and it's in your kind of DNA. I have an added reason that this is a story that I've grown up with, because my grandfather was in the garden that day. So my grandfather was a young man. He'd come from Kalabagh, which is near the mountains, sort of near Peshawar. He was not any kind of political creature. I mean, I would love to say, it would be lovely for me to say he was a Krantikari, a freedom fighter. I mean, he was a kid who'd come to do a sewing machine deal with a scrap metal dealer who was in a market very near the garden. And what happened to him was that he left the garden minutes before the firing started. So again, you know, it would suit me and my own lionization of myself to say he was there and he dodged the bullets. He didn't. It was almost worse for him because he was with two friends. He tells them, just, you know, keep my food and I'll be back. I've just got to go and do this thing, I'll be back. And he goes to the market, and when he's in the market, he hears the wailing sweeping through the market because this is what has happened. And he rushes back, but when he rushes back, he can't get to the garden. And so he has to wait till morning, like so many Amritsaris did, to find out what happened to the people that he cared about, and they were dead. So he lived with survivor's guilt for the rest of his life, and in many ways was defined by it. So this was a story that I was too close to, and I always resisted writing it. I didn't want to write this because I thought I'm a journalist, I work for the BBC, I thought I don't have the distance to write it. But then I married my husband, who you know, who is a science writer.
How odd that you should marry your husband.
I'm very odd that I married my husband. It would have been odder if I'd married your husband. No, but it's because... but what happened was that while we were, you know, sort of a couple of years into our marriage, I was telling him this story of my grandfather. He said, that's really weird. Do you know about Udham Singh? I said, yeah, I'm Punjabi. And he said, well, my grandfather's friends and my great-uncles lived with Udham Singh in London. So it just suddenly became this sort of itch that you can't stop scratching. And it took me this long to get my head into the space where I could write something about the massacre, my grandfather's experience, and then this creature, Udham Singh, who is a legend in India. If you go to the Jallianwala Bagh now, they've just put a statue up of him with his hand stretched out like this, with his palm full of supposedly blood-soaked earth. And you know, like Kim in many ways, you know, that is almost it's a two-dimensional, even though it's a statue, representation of a story that has a lot more complexity. And I love a story with complexity, and so that's how I got pulled into it.
So this shows you something about the impact on Punjab, that we actually have within 10 feet two people whose grandfathers were there. We have Navdeep Suri here, whose grandfather, who turned out to be the great Punjabi novelist Nanak Singh, was with two friends, and he survived while his two friends died. And Navdeep will probably tell us this story tomorrow in his session. And you have Anita's grandfather who escaped. But talking of Punjab, and Kim, feel free to come in wherever you feel like, what was happening in Punjab at that time? Because a lot of other things were happening. Jallianwala Bagh was not an isolated incident. Would either of you want to talk about that?
Well, do you want to start off? Because I mean, you paint the picture beautifully, and I focus much more on sort of individuals' experiences in that time. So is that all right?
So this is, of course, after the end of the First World War, you've had 1.4 million soldiers and workers, huge resources and financial contributions from India to the British war effort. Gandhi is recruiting for the British Army right up to 1918. People return from the war expecting some kind of reward in terms of increased self-governance and reforms. And the British at the time, and this is where it gets complicated, they both reward the Indians, loyal Indians, mind, with the so-called Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, which are unprecedented. But they also pair that with repression in the format of the Rowlatt Acts, which is essentially continue the wartime emergency measures. So you have the carrot and stick being used at the same time, which means that there's really sort of an acute sense of uncertainty and dislocation politically. And this is combined with the flu pandemic, which kills 12 million Indians. There's failure of harvest, there's high food prices, the entire trade in Amritsar, which is an important trade entrepot, has been disrupted by the war as well. So it is sort of a perfect storm of both socioeconomic disruption but also political turmoil.
And you have a man in charge in the form of Michael O'Dwyer, who also says, I mean, just a fascinating character. So Michael O'Dwyer, who is the Lieutenant Governor of Punjab, is an Irishman. He's not just an Irishman, he's an Irish Catholic. Not just an Irish Catholic from Tipperary. So, you know, the people he has grown up with have been nationalists. They have been people who have demanded freedom. But Michael O'Dwyer's family is very, very different. They are loyal to Westminster. Michael O'Dwyer's father, who is the man he worships above everybody else, he says he's a man's man, a paragon of all virtue. His father believes that Westminster's might is right and that these Irish nationalists or Fenians they represent chaos, they represent madness, and they are to be repudiated. And what happens is that Michael always worries for his father because he stands out amongst the Catholics. He just worries that someday somebody is going to shoot him. There are some very high-profile political assassinations that take place by the nascent IRA, as we would call them now. And he thinks that this is a matter of time. He lives with this anxiety, and sure enough, when he's studying in London, there are these Irish nationalists who fire into the O'Dwyer house. And though they don't kill him, his sister and his father are in the house, and he has this enormous sense of loathing, particularly when the stress he believes directly as a result of these nationalists causes his father to have a terrible stroke from which he never recovers. So, the causality of these things, you've got all of this turmoil. You have a man sitting in the governor's house in Lahore who believes all nationalists bring about chaos. So nationalists are bad enough, but these upstart Indian Brahmins in particular, he classifies Indians like a botanist classifying poisonous subspecies. But the upstart Indian nationalists, the worst of all. And so he is there, he's using the Rowlatt Act like a heavy hammer, and so the scene is set, and he's paranoid that these nationalists are gaining too much strength and momentum. So it's just a perfect storm, really, which leads to this.
But at the same time, while all this is happening, the British government is actually trying to move very, very nascent reforms towards self-government. And Michael O'Dwyer is coming out, as you mentioned, very strongly against this. There is another thing happening at the same time, is the return of the Ghadar revolutionaries, born in the west coast of America 3 years earlier, and they return, and their conspiracy in 1915 is actually betrayed, and Michael O'Dwyer comes down very hard on it. Yet, and this is a question which I'm going to ask you to respond to, one, the justification given for the shooting at Jallianwala Bagh later was that if Dyer had not acted as he did, this massive conspiracy, this rebellion that was brewing in Punjab, which had links with the Bolsheviks, with the Germans, and with everybody else who could be naughty, would have taken over Punjab. And now, clearly there was no, as it was later discovered, there was no such rebellion or conspiracy. So was it an ex post facto justification, or they really feared that? And this is your point of colonial panic, which you talk of in the book. Was this colonial panic at the level of the highest authorities, or is it colonial panic of colonial wives who were worried that they would become victims of brutal rape and murder like had happened in 1857?
I'd say it's very much both. I think if we look at something like E.M. Foster's A Passage to India, we see echoes of it in Orwell's Burmese Days. There's a deep-seated colonial mindset, which is about a sense of vulnerability, even at the point of absolute colonial control. After 1857, British rule in India is quite firm and secure, and yet the British, they never get over this fear and suspicion that the Indian soldiers, for instance, on whom their authority ultimately rests, might turn against them. And from a British perspective, as Anita indicates, there's no such thing as a peaceful Indian crowd. There's no such thing as a legitimate grievances, because obviously British rule is good and the best. So if you are opposing British rule, you must have been put up to it, because you don't have any actual grievances. And so it's Western-educated nationalists, so-called agitators and seditionists, who are believed to be stirring up trouble. And that's why it is really a conspiratorial sort of mindset that the British are operating on.
And I mean, you've heard the expression of a virtuous circle. This is an unvirtuous circle. So then the more that the British crack down on these young men, the more that they fear these soldiers who have come back and regard them as these mutineers, would-be mutineers, the more they create them. So you have people who are not necessarily radicalized, who come back from the war, who find that they've got the Rowlatt Act pounding their loved ones, making their lives much more difficult, taxations which are punitive when they're expecting reward. And so this radicalization begins. And in Udham Singh's case, there is a young man. You know what? This is not a news story. It's a news story, and it's a story that we read even now, which is the radicalization of a dispossessed young man who feels he has nothing, feels he has little recourse, feels he has no hope, and then gets herded in to this world of violent retribution. And even somebody who is born with so little, and I sort of say this, Udham Singh was a man who had less than nothing. He was low caste, and it's important to say that he was low caste, because it means that among Indians who had so little, he had even less. He was an orphan. He had no parents to love him. The only person he had ever loved dies in the orphanage in which he's brought up. Amritsar is his parent, actually, and this is why the attack on Amritsar, I believe, attacked him so very deeply. He's raised in an orphanage not very far from Jallianwala Bagh. And he is a man who fought with the British, had a very undistinguished career in fighting with the British Army in Basra, comes back and can't afford to feed himself and can't afford to put clothes on his back. This is something, a template of radicalization that is true today as it was back then. And then what is unusual is that this is a man who spends 20 years trying to change himself into the avenging angel, who, if any of you have read Tom Ripley, he is a man who will go and find whoever can teach him how to be this killer and learn from any one of them. If you hate the British, then you are my teacher.
Why don't you say a few words about the character that evolved? He was a completely unreliable sort of man who would say one thing to one person. Was it all deliberate? Was he a lone wolf? Was he a lunatic? No, because that's what's been said.
Yeah. So I mean, it's so the narrative that has existed for always pretty much, and was that he was somehow a lone wolf, a Walter Mitty type character who made up things and was a fantasist and got lucky. That he just happened into this meeting at Caxton Hall. I mean, I should say this assassination that took place after 20 years takes place in Westminster in the heart of London. So, and there's a very macabre symmetry about this, because the place, Caxton Hall, where it happens, is almost the same distance from the Houses of Parliament as Jallianwala Bagh is from the Golden Temple. So this kind of sacrilege is a mirror image of sacrilege that takes place. And that idea that he was some lucky loony was propagated by the British. And what I've done in the book is that, the British are brilliant at the dark arts, but they're also fabulously good at bureaucracy. So, you know, they do the paperwork. So you just need to find that slipstream of paperwork, and you will find how they discuss how they are going to separate him from any political motive, how they are going to paint him as a nutcase, how they're going to lean on the press. And there is a, you know, I'm a member of the press. It is disgraceful how the media at the time roll over and do what the British say, Reuters in particular, horribly complicit in separating truth from reality. And they are the ones who create this image. Because, and you've got to understand why they would do that. There are two wars that are important here. So there is the war, the First World War, after which you have Jallianwala Bagh. And you have the Second World War, which is exactly when Udham Singh takes his revenge in 1940. Why do the British want to separate him from any kind of political motive? Because they're sending Punjab's boys to die again in a foreign war. So the last thing they want is some, you know, political upheaval to show the people of Britain that they are vulnerable, and to show the people of India that Jallianwala Bagh is still a memory that exists and lives. So that is why they go into overdrive to separate them. And I was very fortunate. I mean, I, you know, came across lots of wonderful documents that I mean, not one smoking gun, but so many smoking guns in this.
But in both cases that you mentioned, the media is silenced. Jallianwala Bagh, for about 6 months, nothing reliable came. For about 2 months, even London didn't have a full picture of what had happened there. The same thing happened with Udham Singh, but yet the news leaked out. In Udham Singh's case, in fact, this, as you call him, this low-caste, orphan, underprivileged Indian suddenly became the subject of Goebbels. And he used the shooting. You want to talk about that?
Well, the Nazis leapt on it because, you know, for them, it was manna from heaven. Because the British, you know, they felt themselves to be the heroes of World War II. The Germans wanted to remind their people that they were fighting on the right side. So when Udham Singh did what he did, there was like an hour lag between the Germans. Goebbels rewrites the news bulletin to say, look, this is the avenger of Jallianwala Bagh, these brutish Brits, what they did in India, finally they're getting their comeuppance. To tell the German people, you're fighting on the right side. You're fighting against these barbarians who do these terrible things. I think the German broadcast is the first, not even an Indian broadcast, a German broadcast from Berlin is the first to call him a freedom fighter.
Yeah.
A fighter for freedom. So, you know, you have that. And you were asking about the personality of Udham Singh. It's extraordinary. This person who comes from so little becomes such a quick study of how to travel on false documents, how to infiltrate groups that can help him, how to meet people that matter, how to make everybody trust him as if they are the only person in his life. And as a result, he was such a charmer. You know, people were devoted to him, and he used them and discarded them. Even when he has the chance to be happy, you know, he has this period of time in America where he falls, one would assume, in love with a Mexican woman called Lupe, and according to one, you know, a confession of his, has 2 children by that woman, and then discards them all because this vow of revenge keeps pulling him back, pulling him back.
Yeah. So I think if I go back, Kim, to what we mentioned in passing, I wanted to have a word about Mahatma Gandhi's change of stance after Jallianwala Bagh. You mentioned him as the chief recruiter for the British Army. He did say that if I recruit for you, I will rain men on your army. And then Jallianwala Bagh changed him completely. At the same time, Udham Singh's act was criticized by Mahatma Gandhi straight away as an act of insanity. And then later, after independence, Pandit Nehru changed the stance and Udham Singh became a hero. In both cases, dramatic changes.
Well, I mean, Gandhi is not yet Mahatma in 1919. This is the first moment where he really comes to the fore and starts his sort of mass mobilization. To be quite frank, I don't think Gandhi knows what he's really doing in 1919. A week before the Amritsar Massacre, he tells his followers that as long as you purify yourself, as long as you fast, British airplanes, bullets, and machine guns can't touch us. That's a week before Jallianwala Bagh. And afterwards, of course, he calls it a Himalayan blunder, as we all know. But it takes him a very long time to actually lose faith in the British. So Rabindranath Tagore, he returns his knighthood a month and a half after the massacre in May, in late May. Gandhi, he waits until January 1920 when he sees the outcome of the Hunter Committee before Gandhi returns his wartime medals. He has much more patient.
But he launched his own inquiry.
Yeah, he's part of the Independent Indian National Congress Party inquiry alongside. But it's not till August 1920 that the non-cooperation movement is launched, and we can really talk about it a break. So it's not like the Amritsar Massacre, sort of like a bulb going on. It's a prolonged progress of increasing sort of dissolution.
Yeah.
And I mean, in 1940, you have to understand the motivations of all of these people at the time they do these things. So when Gandhi is calling Udham Singh a lunatic, he is doing so because he is struggling to fight this narrative that Michael O'Dwyer, the murder victim, has been pushing all the way along. It's always been Michael O'Dwyer's contention that the Indians are savages, they kill each other, they don't know how to rule themselves, they cannot be left to themselves, they are an inferior race, we have to look after them. Paternalism, in the extreme, paternalism plus the die-hard philosophy he signs up to means that he thinks they are too primitive to govern. And so Gandhi and Nehru are trying very, very hard to push a second stream argument, which is we are not those people, we are not like that. So when Udham Singh does this thing, strikes at the very heart of London, they immediately say, that's not us. That is not what we do. We don't shoot old men. We're not like that. And so Udham Singh falls just hideously and tragically through the cracks.
And when he falls between the cracks, he's hanged and buried in Pentonville prison here. And in full disclosure, I must say that I was researching Udham Singh with Anita for my own purposes, and she offered to take me to Pentonville prison years ago.
That's a really good date.
To see the place where he was hanged and buried. Yeah. And when we reached the prison and we were met by the office there, they said, yes, you can go in. I mean, they allowed me to go in and told us you can't because she's a dangerous journalist.
So can I just get, I think, the only person who's ever broken into prison. So what happened was I'd been working on this permission for over a year to get into Pentonville, and I'd been working through an ex-governor of Pentonville, and I sorted it all out, and I thought it would be wonderful, Navtej, to see it as well, because, I think it's wonderful to share these insights when you can with whoever's working on it. So I celebrate all and everybody who does research in the field. And we got there, and quite right, they said, well, he can come in and you can't. So I went a little bit ballisto.
Yes. She turned Punjabi.
I did a little bit. I think at one point I did actually say, get me the Home Secretary on the phone. Because you will really, really regret this. And then I don't know what happened. But we were kept and fed tea and biscuits for about an hour, and then we were allowed in.
But then we saw it. And then ultimately, Udham Singh's remains were taken back to India 1974, and he was given a proper cremation 44 years.
I mean, it was like a state funeral, actually.
Yeah.
It was, I mean, everywhere. Indira Gandhi, Nehru's daughter, Nehru, who had repudiated him at the time of the assassination, sits with his coffin, welcomes his coffin to Kapurthala House. When it touches down at the airport in Delhi, there are people lining the streets, crying in the rain. This is a very heavy monsoon, but they've been waiting for hours. An American journalist working for the Washington Post says, he follows the cortege everywhere it goes. The streets are lined with weeping people because our boy has come home. And then, as you say, the two future presidents, Gyani Zail Singh and Shankar Dayal Sharma, are involved
at the
airport to receive him, and one sits by his pyre as it burns.
But you don't answer the question in your book. Would you like to answer today? Was Udham Singh at the massacre or not?
Well, I don't like to say things I don't know. And the truth is only Udham Singh knows this. I don't find any documentary evidence that definitively puts him there. What I can say is that all of the things that were written that he definitely was not there, they spring from British propaganda that tried to separate him. And the strongest thing they can say at the time in 1940, and remember this is a time when they have access to all records, all military records, and Udham Singh, as you know, served in the military. This story then came out of another book by another man that he was serving overseas at the time of the massacre, so he couldn't have been there. It's based on a misconception or falsehood.
We finally don't know that he was there or not.
Well, I think the most banal explanation is often the right one. So while I was researching, I spent a lot of time in Sanam, which was his hometown. And this was something that people would only talk to me, but as long as I didn't identify who they were, because he's such a son of Sanam, that he was in a neighbouring village in the Manja area, and that he was distributing leaflets because he was trying to become somebody. When he came back from the war, was this disillusioned. He was trying to prove himself to the nationalists, but they treated him like a grunt, you know, just like a lowly nobody. So he was doing leafleting for them, and he sent a lot of people to the garden that day. So in a way, you know, my grandfather was destroyed by survivor's guilt. In a way, he was unmade and made by survivor's guilt again, because he sent people there but wasn't necessarily there. But you know, I've left those avenues all open, so you decide for yourself, because until I know something for sure, I won't tell you.
And there's also the legend that his great hero, Bhagat Singh, the other revolutionary, also went to Jallianwala Bagh and took a vow on the soil of Jallianwala Bagh. But I think somewhere in your book you also doubt that.
Well, I just say, you know, he was 12 years old at the time, so the thought of a 12-year-old going from Lahore to Amritsar to do that pilgrimage is rather extraordinary. But I also say this is an extraordinary young man who came from really fiery revolutionary stock. His father and his uncle had been in prison from the time he was born, in and out of prison, agitating against the British. So, you know, I will tell you what people say and I will tell you what we know, and then leave it to you to make up your mind, because I think that's where the truth lies.
So that's what happened in India, but in the UK, Dyer came back. He was knocked out of service and brought back, and there was a huge debate. And then you say it was a complex story, because here the debate of his complexity took place. There were a lot of people who defended him.
Well, one of the things that's come out of the centenary of April this year is the whole idea that he was already punished by the government at the time, that even Churchill disavowed and criticized his actions. Which is a bit of a simplification, because there was widespread support for Dyer, and as most of you will probably know, there was a public fund by the Morning Post, which collected money from local people, but throughout the empire. But Dyer really became singled out. That's one of the reasons why we talk so much about him, because he's the only one who is, in a sense, put on the spot and who is forced to resign from the army, while there was, in fact, a whole lot of other officers who deployed airplanes to bomb and machine gun rioters, who carried out these sort of fancy punishments elsewhere in Punjab. But Dyer's own admissions during the Hunter Commission made it impossible to defend his actions, and so even Churchill, who was certainly, you know, is not an anti-imperialist by any stretch of the imagination, had to disavow his actions. But that was in order to recuperate the moral high ground of the empire. It was not because the logic behind Dyer's actions was perceived as wrong. And so the need for exemplary force and violence never went away. It's only that the problem was that Dyer had too openly and too explicitly admitted.
So it ultimately became that he's a bad egg.
Yeah.
It's an exception, and the rest of the imperial enterprise is good.
But even the bad egg thing was so reluctantly done. I mean, it was so one of the things when you write a book is that all the really extraordinary things will happen after it's published, and people will get in touch with you and tell you stuff that you think, God, if you'd written to me 3 months ago, that would have been really helpful. So somebody got in touch with me whose forebear was on the Hunter Commission and found sort of letters saying, you know, that they had done so, they had repudiated Dyer regretfully because he had given them no choice. So they didn't want to do it. They didn't want to deprive this man of his army career, but they felt he had given them no choice. So.
Was he Udham Singh's initial target? And if he hadn't died on his own?
He was one of right from the start, Udham Singh, according to people who knew him back then, wanted to kill both men. Dyer and O'Dwyer and took these. You see, there's this thing that nobody knows the difference. Today, we do. We amalgamate these two people into one sort of composite devil. You know, the O'Dwyer-Dyer name is not helpful in that. So, you know, I've heard people even now in India say, you know, if you do Google searches, you'll have Michael Dyer and Brigadier General O'Dwyer. You know, it is a really confusing thing. At the time, people knew exactly who they were talking about. And if you look in Udham Singh's diaries and the letters and the notes that were found in his room when the police raided, it is very, very clear he knows who he is going for and he knows how he's going to do it. It's utterly premeditated, and it is a man who's not mistaking his targets one little bit.
Before we move on to the questions, I think we have some time for that. I just want to provoke you a little bit. And 100 years later, how do we remember this history? Because I tell you, I felt very hurt when I visited the Bagh recently, because I think it's too happy a place today. It's got hedges, it's got children playing, it's got people taking selfies, it's got flowers. It doesn't give you an idea and a feeling of austerity or sobriety or tragedy, and doesn't evoke the kind of horror that, say, a visit to the Auschwitz concentration camp evokes. So it's too happy a place. The statue that you spoke about, Udham Singh standing outside the Bagh, has no resemblance whatsoever to Udham Singh. There's even a wrong photograph of Udham Singh in the museum. It's the other Udham Singh who was a Ghadar revolutionary and not this Udham Singh. So why, I mean, and you mentioned that there are 2 urns of Udham Singh's ashes which are still lying in Sunam, waiting for a memorial for the last 50 years.
Yeah, that is true. That is true.
So
I have mixed feelings about the garden. I mean, I know what you mean. When you say the hedges, I think we ought to expose the hedges in their full horror. They've cut topiary soldiers who are like holding guns. But the thing is, it's India, so these things wilt. So they're all shooting their feet. So I mean, it's just awful. That's awful. But, you know, the fact that people were having picnics, I took my 2 very small boys there last year. And the fact that they were laughing and playing and eating a picnic, to me was quite fitting, because that's what my grandfather was doing. And that's what they were all doing. And it was a reminder that this was not some seething cauldron of political discontent. It was a place where people were just getting out of the Vaisakhi, you know, hectic Amritsar, and they were doing what they are doing. How did I mark the anniversary? Well, very oddly, actually. So Kim very kindly passed me a number for Rex Dyer's granddaughter and said, do you want to talk to her? And I said, actually, I really don't want to talk to her until I finish the book, because if I like her, it's going to change the way I write about this, and if I don't like her, it's going to change how I do this. So I only rang her after I'd finished the book and handed it in. And I rang her up and I said, oh, hello, my name's Anita, Anand. And she said, oh, I know you from the radio. I said, that's not why I'm ringing. Your great-grandfather tried to kill my grandfather. Do you want a cup of tea? And she said, yes, I would very much like that. And she came to the house and we sat together for 2 hours. And I was really nervous about this meeting, during which time she expressed not 1 ounce of regret over what he had done. She still thinks he did the right thing and the only thing that was open to him. At one point, I mean, I've written about this in the papers, she said, I went out because I don't know what, I just wanted to be the best me, to show that, you know, we are not savages. Look at us. I know it's a sort of a throwback feeling, but I got really expensive chocolate brownies, and I sort of offered her one. She goes, have you poisoned them? And I said, are you sure? Do you really think that? Are you worried about that? And she said, well, I said, would it help if I ate half? And I did have to eat. So but the upshot is I asked her if she wants to come to Amritsar with me. And I will show her what the garden, she's not been. And I want to show her the Bagh, and I want to show her the garden. And I want to, I mean, she said at one point, do you want me to apologise? And I'm not going to. And I said, I thought at that time, actually, I don't care about an apology. I mean, my grandfather, it doesn't matter to him, and it doesn't matter to his friends, they're dead. But what I really want is for you to understand, just to see the truth. And that really is all I care about.
So I'm going to open up now. I don't see a assistant here, so we'll do, yes. Please, yes, we come to you, yes.
Just a very quick one, if you could allow to dash. Did you send a copy of your book to Dyer's granddaughter?
Yeah,
Good.
I did.
Question here? Go on.
Can I?
Just
I wondered if the massacre and the assassination had any lessons for Britain at the moment, which is going through a imperial moment of nostalgia. Despite rather nebulous notions of global Britain, there's a Panglossian notion of this benign rule that built railways and introduced the rule of law. Does the massacre and the assassination offer any lessons for this contemporary moment when, yeah?
I think if we think about the notion of an apology, which has been discussed quite a bit last April, I think you see just how deeply entrenched these ideas of past grandeur really remain. So there was, in February of this year, there was actually a debate in the House of Lords about an apology, where everybody there, it was sort of a Churchill citing marathon. And the response from Baroness Goldie was that the best way we can commemorate the massacre is to celebrate Britain's role in the world in doing good, and how we continue to prevent situations that allow for the Amritsar Massacre, something like the Amritsar Massacre, to happen. So that the debate about the apology became a celebration of British exceptionalism. And so for me, it's just an example of how we desperately need a language, a critical language, to talk about empire and Brexit, if I may say so. So I don't think there's any lessons as much as warnings, really.
Well, I mean, I will see your House of Lords debate and raise you a Westminster Hall debate. Did you see that one as well? So the Westminster Hall debate involved members of the House of Commons. And in it, Mark Field, you two former diplomats will love this. I don't know whether, did you see
he's
this?
not former.
No, he's serving. I do beg your pardon. But this was extraordinary. So it was Indian MPs of Indian extraction who stood up and spoke very movingly about what Jallianwala Bagh had meant and how much an apology would mean, and also British members of Parliament with large Indian constituencies who also said the same. And then Mark Field stood up. Did you see this? And Mark Field said, "Yes, no, I can understand. There's a lot of hurt involved in this, and I must say, you know, I actually think it does get in the way of trade." So, you know, because we you know, we don't have this problem with Pakistan and Bangladesh. So if an apology would sort that out, then maybe it's something worth considering, although I have a much more, what did he say? He said a much
nuanced
more...
approach?
No, he said a much more traditional idea of what empire is all about, meaning it's quite a good thing. But if it takes an apology to grease the wheels, then I'll do it. And everyone was expecting, okay, well, that's weird, but all right, there's an apology coming, and then it didn't come. So there we are.
A question there, please.
Miss Anand, I have a question, small, short question. You mentioned the social background of O'Dwyer. He's obviously what in IRA language is called a castle Catholic. But in the case of Dwyer himself, what is his social background?
Dyer. So Reginald Dyer, and your name is Abdul Karim, isn't it? You were in the last session, I remember you. So yes. Sorry, that's weird. It sounds like I'm stalking you. I'm really not. I love historical figures turning up to my talks. That's all. So Rex Dyer was born and bred India. He loved India. So his family owned breweries. His grandfather had come to India and had been this sort of buccaneer fighting pirates off the Indian coast to make sure that cargo went to Britain unimpeded. And then his father, who is a great businessman, comes along and sets up breweries to feed the thirst, the unquenchable thirst of the Raj. So he grows up sort of in quite an affluent situation, spends most of his time in the hill station setting. His mother, when she marries his father, she happens to be there at the time of the mutiny. They're not touched by the mutiny, but they take in refugees from the mutiny. So his mother is very, very influenced by these horror tales from people who've been evacuated from areas that have been affected. So he has that in his DNA. He has this enormous passion for India, but his India is different. His India is an India where the Indians salam, where, you know, when they don't, there is something wrong with the order of things. He hates going back to Britain. He's sent back to Britain to do boarding school.
Ireland.
Ireland, I beg your pardon, Middleton College in Ireland. And he hates it, absolutely hates it, has a terrible stammer, is picked on by his schoolmates because he has this stammer and he has these Indian ways. And when, you know, he is deprived of his Indian home after the Hunter inquiry, he withers. He withers away like a flower neglected on a vine and dies miserably in England. So that, you know, that is him. Does he feel any regret? He's a bit different to Michael O'Dwyer, and I sort of have this scene in the book where I found a wonderful thing in an otherwise really rather dull autobiography, but it is him hearing two students at the Oxford Union discussing Jallianwala Bagh, and he sort of the man, the Indian who is there in the Oxford Union having tea with his friend. So this man is sort of listening a little too intently, and he comes over, elderly man, and says, "Tell me, what do you make of Dyer?" And this man, Kripalani, goes off on one, as we'd say, and says he should be a monster, he should have been hanged, should have been killed. This is a disaster that he's been exonerated and allowed to live. And he says, "I am that unfortunate man," and walks away. And Kripalani says he is just a husk of a man, grey. You know, he hasn't got the Indian sun to light him up anymore, so he's grey and shambles away.
Yeah.
There are many accounts of him having regret or doubt, at least doubt about what happened.
But before you go away with such a sympathetic picture, you must I refer you to a passage in Jawaharlal Nehru's autobiography, or was it Discovery of India, in which he describes that he was traveling in a train compartment and he heard a lot of British officers speaking at night, and one man was really boasting about what he did in Amritsar. And when the train stops at Delhi station, this man walks down in striped pajamas, and he discovers it's Reginald Dyer himself boasting to the other soldiers. Navdeep, you have a question? I'll come back to you. Yes.
Well, you know, as one who belongs to Amritsar, I really do want to profoundly thank both Kim and Anita for the research that you've done and added so much light, so much perspective to matters that are so dear to us. That's one thing. Anita, a question for you. You know, you really brought up some interesting perspectives on the extent to which the government went to disconnect Udham Singh from Jallianwala Bagh. And then towards the end of the book, you got this sort of anticlimactic situation where he's using the wrong bullets, and he could actually have had the Secretary of State and several other worthies. And you know, if you wanted to expand on that particular aspect. And Kim, just a small question for you, because I'm only halfway through your book, but the character of Hansraj, you depend on a lot on his testimony. Well, how reliable is that in the context of the research that you've done?
Good point.
First of all, this is going to be...
We'll just answer this question, then I have 3 hands. We'll combine the questions and we'll come back. So we have time. Come.
This sounds like a really sickening, sycophantic support group, but I just wanted to thank you so much for your translation of Khun Vesaki. It's such a moving, beautiful, beautiful account of that time, a time of complete horror. And it always, to me, seems striking when people create beauty out of such, I suppose it is well-fertilized soil, but fertilized in the worst possible way with blood. The thing about the, you see, if I were writing fiction, I wouldn't have done that, but real life is just messy and awful. So Udham Singh, who they wanted to paint as this lunatic who, you know, just gets lucky and wanders into Caxton Hall and just so happens on this meeting at Caxton Hall, he fired 6 shots that day. This man who had a really undistinguished career in the army has spent years honing his art. So as one of the prosecution lawyers writes in his notes, and that's the wonderful thing about going through notes from that era, you have pencil marks. And he just wrote this line saying, every bullet found a billet. And he shoots the Secretary of State for India. He shoots a former governor of Bombay, another former lieutenant governor of Punjab, And you know, every bullet counted, but you're quite right, he got bullets that didn't fit the chamber of his gun properly. So the only person he ends up killing is the one who he shoots first and with the greatest intimacy. It's almost like a scene from an opera. You know, he goes as close as he can. Michael O'Dwyer turns around, must have thought he wanted to shake his hand, and he pushes it right into the fabric of his coat so that there are scorch marks in his coat. I saw the post-mortem results at the time, and fires twice. First time, it goes straight through that man's heart. The second shot that he loosens must have been so fast, with a heavy gun. I mean, don't ask me how, because you'll get me and everyone else into trouble who was involved in this, but I held and fired a gun like this. This thing is heavy. It has one hell of a kick on it. You have to bring your hand down with such speed, and it's not easy, but he lets off another shot while this man is still standing before he crumples to the ground, and it follows a parallel trajectory also through his heart. So, you know, that is, if you were writing fiction, he would have been a dead shot with all of them. But in non-fiction, he gets, you know, he gets the man he was after.
This is good fiction.
Oh, it's a good fiction? Okay. But it is actually what happened. You know, some of the bullets get caught in people's handkerchiefs because the propellant gas gets in the way.
We're going to take these two questions and combine it, and then you still have to answer the Hans Raj point.
Yeah, sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm running out of time, so we'll have to keep the
Sorry.
answers quick and short.
The massacre tends to be treated as a one-off horror, without in any way defending General Dyer. There was in fact a background of revolutionary and quite frightening activity in the town at the time. So I mean, there was some justification for the nervousness of the military, isn't that true?
Well, could we take the question from the lady, and then I'm going to pass this on. This is Kim's favorite question. Yes.
Thank you. My question is for Kim. At the two excellent talks you gave recently at the National Army Museum in Chelsea, you did bring out some material which was exploding some popular myths. And I don't know if there's time, but I feel it might be illuminating for the audience here. And I feel, in the interests of balance, I should mention that at his two excellent talks, he was revered for the quality of research and his book. And I just would like to pay tribute and make sure the audience are aware that Kashi House hold him in very, very high esteem for his research. Thank you.
So all yours, all three questions.
Hans Raj, I have over-relied on a young Indian man who's almost like Udham Singh, but who becomes a British informant after the massacre, and which is why we have his eyewitness accounts. Of course, it's extremely unreliable. There's a lot of torture of witnesses. At the same time, it's all we have. I mean, that's the problem with historians. We have to work with what we have. So I've used him to sort of flesh out details, what goes on inside Amritsar at the time. But I haven't actually used him to ascertain any facts in that respect. So I've used him with caution, really. In terms of the conspiracies, no, there isn't actually any sort of Bolshevik conspiracies. There's no links to the Third Afghan War. There's no. I mean, the British O'Dwyer is scared of a mutiny amongst the Indian troops, but there's not a single rifle or pistol shot fired against the British in 1919. People throw stones, they use sticks, they fire banks. British civilians are killed, but it's riots we're talking about. But to the British, it is a replay of 1857. So that is the disconnect. But yes, I mean, there is. I'm not going to say there's good people on both sides. There's a very, very significant disproportionality in terms of. So on the 10th of April in Amritsar, 5 Europeans are lynched. 30 rioters are shot, and 3 days later, 600 Indians are shot. So that is the context in that respect.
The lady's question.
Well, I think
that was just a statement.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Shyam?
Anita, parallels with the Germans, these imperial gangs that operated at that time, the racism of the Nazis, the arbitrary killings, the other unpleasantnesses associated with Hitler's regime. do you see parallels with these colonial imperial gangs?
There was a really weird thing happening in the 1930s because Udham Singh actually travels to Germany, and we know this because of surveillance that very helpfully is provided by the British in the file that they had about him. So Udham Singh is very much, again, like one of the bombers from 7/7. That, you know, the security services have him on their radar and they lose sight of him. So they know he goes to Germany. They know he's meeting people in Germany, and this is at the time when Hitler's rising to prominence, and they are forming their Russian politik, you know, the race politics of the time. And there is this Foreign Office cadre which is fighting against this absolutism from the leadership, which is that the inferior races, we want nothing to do with them. Whereas the foreign side of it is saying, no, we have to, because if we want to destabilize the British, these are the people to do it. So, you know, there is a very weird thing where Udham travels to a country in the 1930s.
Sorry, that wasn't my question.
Okay.
What were parallels between the German Nazis and the British imperialists?
Well, I mean, I think the German systematic genocide is a pretty unique thing. I think creating a machine of snuffing out a people is a pretty unique thing. I think that colonialism, where it occurs, and whether that's in the Congo with the Belgians and the British in India, I think there are heinous things that happen. But would I go as far as to say that it was on par? I mean, I don't feel the need to do it. I don't know. Is that something that is important to you? I mean, I think it's awful things are awful things. I don't want to call the British Nazis because it doesn't feel right.
I'm going to take two questions, Sham. We can come back to that outside. A gentleman there and the lady there, and then we come probably take the third one and wind it up. We are out of time.
A former member of my religious order was C.F. Andrews, who was the one of the first assessors for Gandhi and for Tagore of the situation there. What is your comment about the significance of this great man?
Very quickly, I think his work is unrecognized, and it's quite remarkable what he does. I mean, he's the first to actually offer a British apology in Amritsar and in Punjab in 1919, and he writes about this at a very, very early stage.
And I can give you I have his exact quotation. And he wrote, he said, "It is an unspeakable disgrace, indefensible, unpardonable, inexcusable." This was C.F. Andrews. Yes, please.
Just one question for all three of you. Was what Udham Singh did right?
God, I've wrestled with this, and I have to say, I don't condone taking life at all. I find it really difficult. So whether it is a man who has undone and presided over unspeakable things, it compromises something in my bone marrow to say that was the right thing to do.
But I think you must preface it with the question was what O'Dwyer did, was it right?
Yeah, and that I can say, no, it was awful and ghastly and monstrous. And likewise, I think, you know, both of those people were. I mean, I'm just uncomfortable with where you're going with that, but what they did was extraordinarily awful, oppressive, and led to the deaths of many innocent people.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask you, as a historians and a journalist who's interested in historical stories, do you think this should be taught in British schools? And if so, very briefly, of course, because we're short for time, how?
So I've been saying this till I've lost my voice, that I was born and brought up in this country, and I can tell you about the timbers in a Tudor roof and a Roman hypercourse system, but sitting in the very epicenter of the Raj, what do people know of the empire here? And I tell you, I did kind of a lot of publicity around the book. I'm very, very grateful that people showed as much interest as they did. Not one time did I do an interview where either on air or off air, the person talking to me said, but I had no idea. But I had no idea. And it's a really boring, and maybe it might be a cliche, it doesn't make it untrue. If you do not learn from history, you are condemned to repeat that again and again in the future.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Kim.